just when you thought this couldn't get any worse. The FDA just last week submitted a proposal to overhaul the way that foods are classified and labeled as, quote, healthy. And they're doing this to make nutrition information more available to consumers because clearly our biggest public health problem is that we have some sort of labeling deficiency on our foods. On this episode, we're diving into this proposal, uncovering the read between the lines messaging, and talking about how this will affect all Americans. Stay tuned.
The number you have dialed has been changed.
Y'all, I'm changing, you're changing, and we are changing our cultural and clinical obsession with size right here. I'm Dr. Maggie Landis, a physician, public health nutritionist, and health at every size educator. And we're doing the hard work here, friends. This podcast is going to challenge everything you think you know about health, nutrition, diets, and weight. I invite you to come for the science and stay for the sass. We are getting this done together because health can't wait. Welcome back to episode 84 of the Health Can't Wait podcast. I'm Dr. Maggie Landis, a physician, public health nutritionist, and health at every size educator. This used to be called the Eatfluencer. Y'all may have been listeners of the Eatfluencer podcast, and there's still lots of great episodes posted on my podcast platform. And I won't keep repeating this week after week, but I just recently went through a rebrand, refresh, and so the name Health Can't Wait is still kind of new-ish. So I might mention a few more times, and then y'all are on your own. So here's what we're talking about today. This episode is called The FDA is Proposing New Labels. Thanks, but no thanks. I had another topic for this podcast and was in the process of preparing it is the right word. And when I heard the news this past week that the FDA is announcing a new proposal for food labeling, I scrapped all that content and we have got to talk about this because I am fuming. I'll try not to get too ragey here because I know that's not really fun to listen to, but this is how they are treating this issue of, quote, healthy nutrition is bad and surprisingly bad. And in so many ways also not surprising at all because they have a long history of this kind of healthism behavior and categorically making certain nutrients good and bad and, really holding up ones and villainizing others. So this is pretty much par for the course. However, I think this is going to make what is already a very toxic landscape in the food industry and for the regular consumer trying to navigate their own personal nutrition. I think this is going to be worse. And we're going to talk about a little bit why that might be and go through just some of the details. You can download, if you get on the internet and look it up, this was released on September 29th from the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the department under which the Food and Drug Administration lives. And it's titled Food Labeling, Nutrient Content Claims, and Definition of Term, quote, healthy. And they actually have quotes on their thing. That's not me saying quotes. So, before I get into really ripping this apart, first of all, it's 35 pages long. I'm not going to go like line by line and tell you every single last thing that is really horrible about this idea, but I want to talk about some general concepts so that you understand the problem with this proposal and also the problem with food labeling in general, because it's a common problem. It's hard for anybody. I mean, even if you're sort of trained in this, but particularly if you're not trained in this, to decode, what is on the label. And it's not a matter of you can't read the label or you haven't been told 500,000 times that sugar is bad and fat is bad and salt is bad and all these things are bad. But knowing the context of that information and how it might be actually impactful for you and your body and your health. Nobody's telling you that. And certainly the FDA is not telling you that. So I want to just pick a few little pieces apart here. I'm going to read basically a line from the, well, it's not a line. I'm going to read you this summary. This is like 3 or 4 sentences. This is the summary of the proposal, just so you know what I'm talking about. Okay, here's where the direct quote starts. The Food and Drug Administration is proposing to update the definition for the implied nutrient content claim, quote, healthy, to be it consistent with current nutrition science, federal dietary guidance, especially the dietary guidelines for Americans, and regarding how consumers can maintain healthy dietary practices. This action will revise the requirements for when the term, quote, healthy can be used as an implied claim in the labeling of human food products to indicate that a food's level of nutrients may help consumers maintain healthy dietary practices by helping them achieve a total diet that conforms to dietary recommendations. I don't really like the word conform in here because that is the complete antithesis of treating people like individuals and intuitive eating and knowing that everybody's needs and resources and limitations are different. Conformity is not the purpose of nutrition, but the FDA believes that we should be doing that. So essentially, what they're going to do is create a new list, because they already do have some criteria for which food manufacturers can put claims about the health of the product on their food labels. But they are going to update these requirements of the labeling. And basically, manufacturers will only be able to label products, quote, healthy if they have a meaningful amount, that's the wording, of food from at least one of the food groups or subgroups, such as fruit, vegetable, or dairy. And the food also must adhere to specific limits for certain nutrients, including saturated fat, sodium, and added sugar. And there's going to be like percentage limits. So, if a food has a certain percentage of saturated fat, that's a certain percentage of its caloric content, they won't be able to label this as healthy. But the whole concept, the bird's eye view problem with this is that villainizing nutrients, villainizing foods and food groups, making foods like in a rank order where some are better and some are bad and some are good for you and some are unhealthy and all this sort of stuff is just cultural rhetoric, because any food can be incorporated into anyone's diet. And besides the moral idea that we are all allowed to eat whatever we want, whether or not it produces health, there is also a way to incorporate all foods and pursue health if that's what a person wishes to do. So there's no clinical reason that these specific things need to be villainized. Okay, so for example, the sugar thing, sugar is, absorbed in the body in the form of glucose. And that's like a very specific chemical compound. Like you can draw it. You probably drew it in your 10th grade chemistry class or whatever. The body doesn't know where the sugar came from, or if the sugar comes in a form of a sweet tart or a banana or orange juice or whatever. Like once it's glucose, it's glucose. So, kind of making certain types of these nutrients good or bad, besides the moral problem with that, it actually doesn't even make any like biological sense either. Okay. Salt. I mean, I'm like people the people that are, saying how we should all limit our salt, that is not clearly, borne out in the scientific literature. There is a very small percentage of people who appear to have what's called salt-sensitive hypertension, meaning that when they consume more sodium, they are at more risk for developing hypertension. But that is not the majority of people. Most people who have normal kidney function, because sodium is, absorbed in your body, and then your kidneys have a set point where they maintain your serum sodium at the level that it's supposed to be at and get rid of excess sodium or hold on to excess sodium to, whatever it needs to happen, literally second by second by second in your, kidney to maintain your serum sodium. So, if you look up and there's all these things about how having too much salt is so dangerous because of the risk of hypernatremia and stuff, you don't get hypernatremic from eating salt if you have normal kidneys. That's not how that works. And they have shown that there are lots of people who consume a tremendous amount of salt and never have a problem with their blood pressure. So instead of making sweeping generalizations about things like salt is bad, why don't we screen people for hypertension, and then on a case-by-case basis discuss with our hypertensive or pre-hypertensive patients what is included in their diet and if there are any gentle modifications, and then seeing if in that individual patient the changes are clinically significant. Okay, that's way different than slapping a big black X on a food saying that it's got too much sodium and nobody should eat it. See where I'm going with this? We're proxying chronic health conditions with nutrients in foods. And that is a very, very, very large chasm to leap across. It basically is not a direct correlation in almost any circumstance. So if we want to talk about chronic health problems, we should talk about chronic health problems. And then in the people who are exhibiting early symptoms of chronic disease, we see what modifications A, might help and prove that they help, and B, discuss what's realistic for their, sort of life circumstances. Okay, and the other thing is saturated fat. I'm going to get back to the saturated fat at the end of this episode, so I'm not going to, beat that horse. But it's, setting limits for all these nutrients makes eating more and more and more complicated for the average person. It makes it an intellectual exercise instead of the pleasurable, many times a day thing that we're supposed to be doing. And here, let's talk about this for just a second too. Salt, sugar, and fat, if you know anything about cooking, those are, the three kind of core elements basically that give flavor to food. So it's pretty unlikely that a food product that has limited salt and limited sugar and limited fat is going to be highly palatable to anybody. It's very unlikely people are going to enjoy that. And, to be honest, it's not very likely that they're going to purchase a lot of that. So what is going to happen, I can just almost guarantee, because this is, pretty much what happened when we vilified sugar and fat through the last couple of decades, is nutrition science tries to come up with all these artificial things and kind of Franken additives to make a product that is even palatable. And then to make the argument that adding all these things and developing these things to substitute for normal nutrients that the body recognizes and knows how to process, and claiming that that is somehow more healthy than just straight up eating food in its native state where it contains salt and sugar and fat, that's crazy. And it doesn't always pan out real well. I mean, y'all remember the whole Olestra thing. That's like, we come up with these like hacks, biohacks, and like workarounds, and the body doesn't take favor to that very well. So I can't even organize my thoughts because this is so bad. But in this document, it also says that the FDA is going to develop a symbol that companies will be using to label food products as healthy. And that I don't think has been totally determined whether it's going to be a like star rating, like 5-star, 4-star, 3-star, whether it's going to be a gold star, silver star, whether it's going to be a stoplight, a green light, a thumbs up, whatever. I don't think that they've actually figured out what they're going to use, but it's going to be some sort of visual symbol that everybody will recognize, including people who don't even read the words, the English words on the packaging. Little kids will recognize this. It will be readily identifiable that this food is classified as good or bad. So just think about for a minute what that might feel like to a 3-year-old or a 6-year-old or a whatever, a teenager who's eating a snack that has a 5-star thumbs up on it, and their friend has a snack that doesn't, and what kind of this false sense of elitism and kind of food elitism and pride in the quote good choices people are going to make. I mean, the influencers are going to be all over the internet trying to sell their 5-star diet meal plan and the green light, can you imagine like green light meals for your family? And it's going to be even more out of hand than it like already is, because what we need is not another division to separate out and categorically name things good or bad in our food supply. The other thing too is that the FDA is planning to adopt front of package labeling instead of back of package labeling, because clearly the reason Americans are eating too much sodium and sugar and saturated fat is because we can't flip over the package and read the back of package label. And so if it were in the front, then we would not eat these things. Okay, now I'm being sarcastic, right? But that's what they're proposing. They're proposing that if the label is moved from the back to the front of the package, the idea is that, the people who, quote, didn't notice it was on the package at all will see it easily and read it and see that this food has, quote, too much sugar or sodium and not make that choice. And then in them not making that choice, they will not develop, let's say hypertension. Okay, we are talking a very shoddy, not well linked chain of events happening from moving a nutrition facts label from the back to the front of the package to somebody having a longer life expectancy without hypertension. I mean, that's frankly kind of ridiculous. So, the history of this, the FDA, this is not the first time that they've allowed healthy, quote, healthy as a descriptor of foods. This started way back in the 90s, and there's been a variety of, rules they've had, but they want to update this. And the interesting part is that they want to update the labeling so that we can conform to the dietary guidelines, which the FDA also makes. So basically, they want to change their own rules from what they used to say to what they want to say now to match the guidelines from what they used to say to what they say now, which that same agency created. So basically to comply with their own garbage rhetoric. Now, interestingly, the way that nutrients and foods interact in the human body hasn't changed in probably like a bazillion years. So the fact that the dietary guidelines have changed so much over the course of, let's say, 50 years. Well, has it been almost 50 years since 1977, right? Pretty close. Oh my gosh. 45 years. And it's just, this is not going to help anybody. And then interestingly, in this document, and I read this whole 35 pages so that you wouldn't have to, they had a whole debate about water being, quote, healthy. Because essentially, water in their structure here would not qualify as healthy because it wouldn't contain nutrients from whatever 2 out of the 3 food groups, or 2 out of whatever their thing is. It doesn't have nutrients. Water is water. Water doesn't have a nutrient in it, so it wouldn't qualify as healthy. So, plus, here's the other interesting part. They are concerned that if they label water healthy with a little check mark thumbs up, which would be bottled water, obviously, because that's the only thing that has a label on it, that it would give the wrong idea to people that bottled water with the thumbs up is somehow nutritionally superior to tap water. And people would feel compelled to spend money on bottled water when really, if they have a safe drinking water supply, that's good for them. In fact, it may even be better for them because it is, most places it's fluorinated. Okay, but see, that's the FDA is worried about people spending money on some bogus labeling for water. But isn't this entire thing about people spending money on bogus labeling? I mean, this is crazy. This is crazy making, even reading this. Now, let's talk about why their ideas are not unbiased. I mean, this group, the FDA, which is led by Dr. Califf, who was the, I guess this is the commissioner, the chairman, I don't know what his title is, but was the leader of the FDA briefly under President Obama, left office, and then got reappointed by President Biden, has major ties to pharma. You can look that up and read. I'm not going to go through all the details of that, but he is a very wealthy man and has made a very large amount of money over the course of his career from pharma and his ties to industry. The other thing, the members of the Dietary Guidelines Committee, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans they have like a 5-year cycle. So every 5 years they publish a new set of guidelines, and then in the interval 5 years, they go through this whole process of like making up the next committee so that they can review all this information and start planning and producing the next set of guidelines that comes out 5 years later. Okay, so the current guidelines we have are from 2020, and they're considered like sort of for the window of time 2020 to 2025. And they're in the process now of putting together their committee that's going to then go to the 2025-2030 guidelines. Well, there have been studies done. In fact, there was an abstract accepted manuscript published in March of this year, of 2022, by Melissa Malon, Nina Teicholz, some other authors who essentially were measuring objectively the incidence of conflicts of interest with the members that were on the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Committee. And without going into all these boring numbers, essentially, let me just read you the results here. Their analysis found that 95% of the committee members, okay, the committee has 20 people. So that means, what does that mean? One person didn't have industry ties. 95%, 19 out of 20 of the committee members had conflicts of interest with the food and or pharmaceutical industries, and that that included particular large actors, that's the language they use, including Kellogg's, Abbott, Kraft, Mead Johnson, General Mills, Dannon, International Life Sciences. I mean, it's just a lot of their funding. It said that 60% of their funding came from industry. This is not a transparent, free from bias, objective, evidence-based process. All right. Yes, They're not supposed to let these industry ties influence their decisions, but you had bet that they are. And that's interesting because these are the companies that make the foods that come in packages that are going to have these labels. So another thing that makes me a little nuts here is I'm going to read you a little section that was in this proposal too. It says, half of all American adults have one or more preventable diet-related chronic diseases. Okay, that sounds like we are eating ourselves into illness, right? And that's what they intend it to make you think when you read this. But could we not, we have to remember our whole correlation causation thing. Diet related doesn't mean diet caused. Okay, related is one of those correlation words with association, correlation, linked to, trends with, all those sort of words. So could we not have written this that half of all American adults have one or more preventable income-related chronic diseases, or stigma-related chronic diseases, or race-related chronic diseases, or I don't have a primary care physician-related chronic diseases, or I don't have any health insurance-related chronic diseases. They all those things are also related to chronic disease, correlated with the incidence of chronic disease. But why does this language appear here as everything is diet related? Because diets, food products, it involves selling things. Kellogg, Abbott, Kraft, Mead Johnson, General Mills, Dannon, they don't fix minimum wage. They don't fix health insurance. They don't fix race stigma. They don't fix educational attainment. They fix labeling on food products. Okay? But I use the word fix very, loosely, because this is not going to fix anything. I think this labeling system is going to do even more harm. The labeling system we have now is already garbage. The dietary guidelines are heavily influenced by industry, very much a one-size-fits-all without any context of, preference, culture, access, anything like that. But this is going to be worse. And let me tell you what, the people suffering with chronic disease are not suffering with a label deficiency. It's not a matter of them not knowing what's in their food or flipping the package from back to front so that they can become healthy people. All right. And guilting them about consuming these now even more villainized nutrients and villainized foods is not going to fix a problem. What's going to fix the problem is most of these people that rely on these types of foods and food products have no access to anything else, have no money for anything else, have no time for anything else, have no, routine preventative health care to pick up on trends early in their health. Then we bring them in to doctors' offices and dietitians' offices and stigmatize their bodies and give them more guidelines, more shame about what they're eating by printing, preschool visual labels on these foods. This is just going to pile more problems on top of problems. Because really, here's the deal. There's only two types of people. There's people who this labeling will make a difference, and the people whose the labeling will make no difference to them. So the group of people who the labeling will make no difference, either because they have no choice what they purchase or are given or feed their families, and so that doesn't matter. Or there's people like me, I would put me in this group, who do have a choice, but don't care because they know this entire thing is bogus. So those are the people who the labeling will make no difference. The labeling will make a difference to people who either believe they can try harder and have another set of goals to achieve and micromanage their diet and their intake that's going to very likely drive them into this cycle of restriction and dieting and disordered eating, and throw another log on the fire when the thin, healthy, privileged influencers who pretty much maintain their health based on their genetics and their, resources will pile all the shame on the quote regular people, because they know that all these problems are caused because you're not eating a 5-star diet. You're not eating a green checkmark diet, a thumbs up diet. This is awful. And nothing good is going to come of this. We really got to get away from categorizing food groups, nutrients, because we lose complete context of eating and nutrition and social access and public health. There is no singular food. And this is interesting because they actually said that in their, let me see if I can find this here. That was actually a comment that they had in this. Oh, yeah, here it is. Here's the direct quote. It's on page 3 if you get to reading this. This is a direct quote from the proposal from the FDA. It says, quote, although nearly all foods can be incorporated into a healthy dietary pattern to a greater or lesser extent, and then it goes on to talk about how all this labeling is going to be helpful. So they even know that basically all foods fit. And the problem is not that we need to be told more about food. I would argue we have too much information and that all of this is conflicting and distracting and stressful and really sort of segregating people into groups of those that can follow the rules and those that can't. The rules, I'm kind of doing air quotes here. This is not healthy. This is not health. And while I'm horrified, I'm also frankly not particularly surprised that this is the next move by the FDA. So if you're interested in reading this yourself and seeing how terrible this is, it's a 35-page, PDF document. You can find it anywhere online by Googling the FDA labeling guideline proposal. September 2022 that's what it is now when it came out. So at the end of September. So anyway, I can't say any more about that. I'm getting too ragey. So let's go to this week's truth or trash. All right, and this week's truth or trash question is inspired by, have y'all seen these butter boards that are like trending on the internet? I don't know where it started, probably TikTok. That appears to be where everything in the kitchen starts. But essentially, it's like a butter version of a appetizer plate or a charcuterie thing. So imagine, if you haven't seen this, imagine taking like a wooden cutting board or a big serving plate or something. It doesn't matter what it is. They call it a board because I guess it's prettier if you put it on the board. And then you take butter, like a lot of butter, like maybe a couple sticks of butter, smash it all down, kind of like almost like you're like buttering the surface of this board. So there's like maybe a, I don't know, 1/4 inch of butter across the whole surface area of the top. And then you put stuff on the butter. Okay. So herbs, olives, bacon, nuts, I don't know, fruit, whatever you feel like putting on this, seasonings and stuff. And then you serve it with, I've seen mostly bread. You could do toast or crackers or whatever. And then you like imagine ripping off the bread and kind of wiping it in the butter and eating it like it's like a communal sort of appetizer thing. I think that's pretty cool, frankly. But all that aside, I think that is truth. That is not trash. The butter boards, that's fantastic. I haven't made one yet, but I'm going to because I think it's a fantastic idea. What I want to mention here in this truth or trash is what about saturated fat? Because the fear of butter, this whole concept of we need to substitute butter and avoid butter and, use oils and use margarine and use other things, it really, where all that comes from is the fear of saturated fat, because butter has a lot of saturated fat compared to some other, let's say, cooking oils and stuff. Well, the current dietary guidelines, you know how strongly I love those, recommend that we should limit our saturated fat intake to 10% or less of our daily caloric intake, which also I don't believe you should be counting calories, so you really shouldn't be counting saturated fat. But based on the, roughly 2,200 calorie diet, which is also ridiculous, we're talking like, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 20 to 22 grams per day of saturated fat. That's going to go by really fast. So just for like a frame of reference, a 1 ounce piece of cheese. Okay, so a 1 ounce piece of cheese is like, you generally like one string cheese or one slice of cheese has about 7.5 grams of fat. Depends on what kind of cheese it is. All right. Or 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 tablespoon. So when you're cutting the stick on the skinniest little line, that's 1 tablespoon. That's about 7 to 8 grams of saturated fat. So you can see how over the course of a day, eating dairy products, eating animal proteins, most people are going to go over 20 grams like really pretty quickly unless you're trying to limit it. And so point being, it's very stressful to try to limit saturated fat. But, what I have understood and what I have read over and over and over in the science here is that it's not that tight of a correlation, and certainly not proven to be causative, that saturated fat causes a clinical problem. Okay? They have done some studies that show higher saturated fat diets. The subjects may have increased LDL cholesterol. But here's the other thing. LDL cholesterol is not universally bad. LDL cholesterol is not like one thing. There's not one LDL cholesterol particle. There's a whole bunch of different types of LDL cholesterol. There's large ones, there's small ones, there's fluffy ones, there's, I forget the word they use, but some of those are actually protective. The larger LDL particles don't seem to be associated with disease, because what we're trying to do is prevent chronic health problems and heart attacks and disease. We don't really honestly care what your serum LDL cholesterol is when you draw your labs. We care whether in 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years you have a heart attack, right? So the interesting thing is one of the big studies, the Nurses' Health Study, which has been going on for decades and has at this point like almost 300,000 participants, 300,000 subjects. That's massive, okay? And the 20-year follow-up data from the Nurses' Health Study shows that the average amount of saturated fat consumed by these subjects was between 12 and 18% of their caloric. So we're talking like 1.5 to maybe nearly even 2 times what this FDA recommendation is. And there was no associations found in all of those people over 20 years with any detrimental effects on coronary heart disease. Basically there's more to it. The whole point of that being that there's more to this. And when we make sweeping generalizations that sugar is bad, sugar gives you diabetes, saturated fat is bad, saturated fat gives you heart attacks, this is not that simple. This is not linear algebra. There is so many factors that compound this. And one of the factors that compounds the development of hypertension and coronary artery disease is stress, is social isolation, is marginalization, discrimination, weight stigma, suboptimal healthcare, lack of prevention, lack of food access. I mean, there's lots of things. So I'm going to say the butter boards are awesome, and worrying about saturated fat to the level of concern that the FDA and the dietary guidelines recommend is trash. I have not seen scientific evidence that substituting the fats in the diet with, canola oil and margarine is better for health outcomes. In fact, there's actually some literature that shows that may actually be concerning. So don't get too hung up on this. All right, make your butter board. I want to hear what you're going to put on your butter board. I'm kind of like the savory type, so I'm probably going to do some herbs and stuff like that. Some people have put blueberries and honey and walnuts, and anyway, we'll get back together. Maybe I'll do a whole episode about butter boards because I think it's almost worth talking about. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm very appreciative for your listenership. Thank you again for being in this community and being an advocate for evidence-based, ethical nutrition recommendations, public health guidelines and healthcare. That is what I am on a mission to really have people telling the tale of. Okay. So if you're so kind to leave a rating or review on the podcast platform before you pop off today, I would appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the topic, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for being here today. I'm so grateful you joined me today. If you're liking the science and the vibe here, I hope you'll tell a friend or two about this podcast. You can also follow me on social media at Maggie Landis MD, or check out everything that I offer and everything I do at my website, maggielandismd.com. The solution is us, my friend, because health can't wait.